I want to welcome everybody. This is the third and final presentation at this camp meeting. As I mentioned yesterday, this is the first camp meeting in a series. And you'll have all received my itinerary, and the next camp meeting is next weekend. I hope everybody's well and ready to study. So I received several questions before this camp meeting. Some dealing with matters that are personal to members and some that are doctrinal. As always, the personal and the political always have a connection. So yesterday we discussed the subject of Sabbath, and I received some feedback from those two presentations. Some people have questions. Some people are asking what I'm saying. Or they disagree with what I'm saying. And other members are concerned. They're concerned that we are throwing away the Sabbath and introducing confusion into our movement. So I just want to address a couple of those points. So obviously I'm guiding this study. I received those questions. Like all of you, I have my own personal thoughts. But I don't think it's anything new that I'm unwilling or unprepared to give my opinion at the beginning of a study. I'm not Elder Jeff and I'm not Elder Tess. And whatever you may understand their roles to be, or the methodology that they used to teach us what they have taught us, I think I've been pretty clear over the years. And I've become increasingly, I hope, increasingly clear on this issue. That I don't have that same role. In many ways, separate to organization, I see my role as a teacher similar to the role of all of us being teachers. I know that many in the movement don't see things that way. And despite my remonstrance with people, I still want to make this point that I don't introduce or define doctrine in this movement. And I understand that that causes people heartache or problems. So we all know Daniel chapter 12, verse 10. And I hope that we all are familiar with how we used to use that verse over the years in this movement, because not many people discuss it nowadays. For the purpose of our discussion, it's really the second part of the verse. The verse compares two groups, two classes. The wicked who do not understand, and the wise who understand. So this passage, in connection with chapters in Isaiah, when we speak about the line upon line methodology, both of those ideas, those concepts, are related to teaching. And the word wise in Daniel 12, verse 10, we used to emphasize the fact that this is talking about teachers. Not just people who understand, but people who give understanding. And this is the same idea that's brought to view in the book of Isaiah, particularly chapter 28, when we use this idea of line upon line methodology, where it talks about the technique of teaching God's people. And I want to remind us that the methodology that we are using separate to it being the methodology that William Miller used, that this is a rebuke to the church. When you read Isaiah 28, God is not making some positive statement. God is critical of the attitude of the church, the appointed teachers. And so God is going to raise up a group of teachers who are uneducated, who are unqualified to do this work, who are not appointed to be leaders or teachers in the work of God. It's a strange work, it's an unusual work. And the reason why it's strange and unusual is not because of the content. It's because of the people that are being commissioned to undertake that work. You and I, the people or the group that we call the priests, this movement. And the reason for this strange, unusual work is given in Isaiah 28, verse 8. Because the tables of Adventism are full of vomit and filthiness. There is no place left that is clean. And I think people in this movement have still not realized or come to terms with this verse. I think many of us still live in hope of a good outcome in our relationship with the church. And so it's coming as a rude awakening, the very right-wing position that Adventism and its leadership is holding today. But it shouldn't. The passages that we used to discuss indicate this. There is nothing good left in Adventism. It's full of filthiness. So coming back to this movement and each of our roles, it's not my role to define doctrine or theology in this movement. I've never believed that to be my role. And not only have I, but I know others, many of you, have spoken about the first, second, and third angels' messages and messengers. And whilst each of you may have an idea, a concept of who and what those people are and what their message is, when you talk about the first, second, and third messengers, I think on closer examination, those ideas are not as firm as many of us think. And even if we hold to those views of who the first, second, and third messengers are, we should be careful to understand what their job function is. So I don't want to speak about others. I'm just talking about myself. And I know that many of you are disappointed that I don't answer questions in the way that you want me to. Straightforward question, short, simple answers. In my experience, we don't move forward when we operate in that simplistic fashion. Not only in this sphere, but in any enterprise in life, it's much more complicated than we initially realize. That's one of the reasons why relationships, particularly marriages, fail. Because we think these issues are straightforward and simple until we get involved in them and we realize they're much more difficult, much more complicated. So as I reviewed these questions on the Sabbath, and if you remember, I said it's taken a long time for this question to arise. Or this observation to be made. And I've just been waiting for it to come into the public domain, open discussion, before tackling it. Because I didn't think it was for me to show this movement problem areas that we're not seeing. So I know we've gone from one leader to another, from Elder Jeff to Elder Tess. And those who knew him personally recognize the person that he was, with all of his faults and failures, and also his many, many good points. But he was a large, white, right-wing American. He had a physical presence about him. And we must be careful not to dismiss the work that was done by him and others and put that all aside because of the change in our message. If we're not doing that, many of us are in danger of doing it. And even if you don't verbalize it, by our very actions, we show this. I'm not giving an instruction to the membership now to change what they're doing, change their practices. It's the midnight cry message that shines the light to the very end of our journey. Those few short months in Millerite history in the year 1844, that short few months didn't undo the decades of work that preceded it. But that work overshadowed those previous decades. And the problem is, many of us are new and we don't have a firm foundation in our past history. And those that were here in those early days have forgotten many of the things that were taught. And I think if we want to remain safe individually and as a body of people, you can't simply throw away the work of the first messenger. With all of its faults and failings. So this is not to attack or accuse any of our leaders. But as sentient thinking beings, as people who have their own opinion, who are supposed to think, if you go back to previous studies that I've done, when I've analyzed the work and the legacy of prophets, I've tried to show and make clear that their humanity gets in the way of their message all too frequently. And if you can see that Elder Jeff's humanity got in the way of his message, and you recognize him as the first messenger, then you must be naive to think that the third messenger also doesn't bring their humanity into the message. And in this context, humanity is weakness. It's not an asset. It doesn't improve the message. It causes problems. All of us bring our baggage with us into this movement. If you don't think that the messengers that God has given to this movement bring their baggage with them, as I said, I think it's naivety. So as we discuss these issues, it's not to dismantle the work of the first and third angel. It's to understand their work better. It's to be intellectually honest about what they have taught. And it's also to be intellectually honest about what we have misunderstood about what they have said. So if you've come to these studies thinking that we're going to come to a conclusion today on the Sabbath, or I'm going to give some definitive answer for you, you're mistaken. And you should know that that could never be the case. And it shouldn't be. Okay, so let's summarize what we've said yesterday. We had a question about Sabbath keeping. Is it okay to go to a class in your school on the Sabbath? Because if you don't go to the class, you will fail the course. So as I said yesterday, this is not a new issue. It's confronted Adventists for decades. In many ways, this was the same issue that was brought out into the open in the 1888 history. How are we as individuals meant to relate to either the state or to private organizations we'll call it society. When society goes in one direction, what are we supposed to do? What should our response be? In the past, we would phrase it this way. Is it better to obey a human, or is it better to obey God? And at a simple level, we all should know the answer to that. But as you listen to people's responses yesterday, you could see that people in this movement, that their views had begun to shift. They'd begun to change from what they were in the past. Before the midnight cry. Now, we don't have the luxury of asking Elder Tess her opinion. We don't have the luxury of asking Elder Jeff his opinion. So we're left to come to these decisions by ourselves. And I don't know what you think about that. Do you think that it's planned by God? Do you think it's time and chance? Do you think that the movement is going to collapse because we don't have a leader any longer? We all have our different thoughts. But we're in this situation and there's nothing that we can do about it. So it seems appropriate and correct to me to try to address some of these questions, even if it's uncomfortable to do so. Even though there are risks associated with it. There are risks associated with doing this activity. Questioning what has been taught, and openly discussing our fears and concerns of what is right and what is wrong. So the question is, what can we do on Sabbath? And to me, that's not the question to be addressed. What I found interesting to think about and what I thought the question that we needed to ask is, why do we as Adventists now begin to question the Sabbath? What's happened in our psyche, in our thinking, to question our relationship to the seventh day? I want us to recognize that there has been a change. It's not just one or two people. This is permeating the movement. That we're questioning our relationship to the Sabbath. Its moral significance and its prophetic significance. And I want to know why. Why has there been a change? So I want to give two options, and not the only ones. So option one, we're a Laodicean church and we've become lazy, worldly, and we have lowered our standards. So that's why our relationship to the Sabbath has changed. So it's a moral issue. Or the other option is that it's a prophetic issue. Like Deuteronomy 22, verse 5. We need to go back to Exodus chapter 20 and re-examine our relationship to the fourth commandment based upon its prophetic significance. What do I mean by that? The change in the prophetic significance of the Sabbath. George, what do you think I mean by that statement?
Not sure, but I think it would be similar to how we dealt with Deuteronomy 22. We check how the instructions were given back to the Hebrews when they left Egypt.
So George has said, the point I'm trying to make is reevaluating our relationship to the Sabbath as we did with Deuteronomy 22, verse 5. So my question wasn't well stated. when we talk about the Sabbath prophetically, what is its significance in prophecy? And according to Isaiah, simplistically put, prophecy is understanding the end from the beginning. So prophecy is connected to the end. And so we see the Sabbath as something to do with the end. Obviously, the end is the end of the world, end of sin. That's what the end is. So we've spoken about our potential relationship morally with the Sabbath. Because we've become worldly. What about the prophetic argument? Why would our relationship to the Sabbath change prophetically? So anyone, or George, you can continue if my questions may be a little bit clearer now, but anybody.
The only idea I would suggest is it would change based on what we understand more about the Sabbath. And what I mean by that is there's a literal Sabbath day, but we can learn lessons from literal Sabbath observance and the reasons behind it to understand prophetic end time implication.
So George has said, when we look at the literal Sabbath, how we observe, view, and keep it, we can learn lessons prophetically. Anyone else have a thought? So Ellen.
Well, I just was thinking about, what happened during the time of Jesus and how the Pharisees had their strict codes, and they even added extra stuff on there just to make sure, they were really keeping strict.
So Sue Ellen has mentioned during the first Advent, the discussion, the tension between Christ and the church on how to keep the Sabbath, which is a similar thought to what I think George was intimating, understanding how Sabbath should be kept. I want to suggest that both of those answers deal with the morality of the Sabbath. And I want to suggest the reason why our relationship with the Sabbath prophetically has changed because as Adventists, we were taught by Ellen White that the Sabbath is the great test at the end. And the word end, I'm saying, means prophecy. And what has fundamentally changed is that the consciousness of this movement believes that there is no Sunday law. And Sunday law is all over this chart. Because the Sunday law is a synonym for Sabbath. They're two sides of the same coin. Two superpowers fighting for the hearts and minds of humanity. The kingdom of Satan and the kingdom of God. And Adventists believe that that warfare is going to be fought over the issue of the seventh and the first day. Apostate Protestantism primarily becomes apostate at the end of the world, when in the book of Revelation it speaks about the daughters going back to the mother. That this issue is about the Sabbath and Sunday. The great test. So if the great test is no longer the Sabbath, because it's not Sunday sacredness, then maybe that's why we're so chilled about Sabbath keeping now. We just view it differently. The spirit of the law, not the letter of the law. So I'm suggesting they're not the only two reasons, but there are several reasons why our relationship to the Sabbath has changed. One is apostasy or morality, the other is prophecy. Where do we find the health message in the Ten Commandments? We're very focused as Adventists on the health message. Because we understand the human being to be both spirit and body. We recognize physical and mental health as being connected issues. So where do we see that in the Ten Commandments? Anybody give me a number?
6.
So I got number 6.
Plus 6. The 6th commandment.
Oh, okay. Sorry, not the 6th commandment, the last 6 commandments. Anyone else? Anyone? Number 5. Honor your parents. So Ellen said, honor your parents so that you will live a long life. That's where you see the health message. Anyone else? George. George says there's no health message in the Ten Commandments. So I thought this would be relatively straightforward, but we're getting completely different answers. I find that interesting. David, where do you see the health message in the commandment says, don't lie? Without stretching those words into something else.
White tells us that mind is connected with our health.
Our mind is connected to our health.
Diseases come from something to be wrong.
So he said that if we lie, it hurts our mind. And if we hurt our mind, it hurts our bodies. And Sue Ellen said that if we treat our parents well, I would suggest when we're adults and they're elderly, that somehow that will bring health to us. Yeah, that's fine. Okay, I want to suggest it's number 6. Thou shalt not kill. I had to count what number 6 was as well. We were all counting what number 6 was. Thou shalt not kill. That means don't kill your... Yeah, the health message. Don't kill yourself. Don't kill others. Preserve life. So I would have gone for that. So the reason I mention that is that most Adventists I've ever met, it's relatively easy to show them how they are killing themselves. You know the idea that we kill ourselves with our forks. And everybody does it. We eat things for pleasure, not for health. And the only reason I say that is because we've taken that commandment and I don't think we follow it to the letter. We follow it in spirit. Because we recognize that it's a very complex subject, the subject of health. So just taking that idea of complexity, that's the only reason I mentioned that. And you bring it back to the 4th commandment. The 3rd option, which I wasn't going to introduce, but I will. We're not in apostasy. We understand our relationship prophetically with the Sabbath. But Sabbath keeping is complex. And the way we approach it is so individual that we can't make any concrete statements about it. we're not sure what work is. We're not sure what servants are. We're not sure who strangers are. And who of us live in gated communities? That was an American joke, sorry. Shouldn't do that. It says when someone comes into our gates. Okay. So the point I'm trying to make is that our relationship to Sabbath and the reasons for the changes are not straightforward. And either simplistically, it's because it's bad, so we've become bad, Laodicean, or Sabbath keeping, like so many other things, is so complicated, we can't make any group position on it. I got in trouble a while ago because I said Sabbath was at 9:03 in the evening. 3 minutes past 9. And someone said, how do you know it's 3 minutes past 9? And I got accused of being legalistic because I said we go for the 3 minutes past 9, not 9. So have we dropped our standards? Is it complicated? We don't really know when sunset is, and does it really matter? Or has our prophetic relationship changed? There's no Sunday test, therefore there's no Sabbath test. And that's what I wanted to explore. So we're focused on the prophetic issue. And the only way we're going to do that is by going back into history, seeing what the literal was, then trying to understand what the symbolic is today. And in order to do that, we need to look carefully. And what I mean by that, I don't think it's safe to go to a few presentations that Elder Tess has done and say that is the definitive answer on this subject. Not because she may have made mistakes. It's because we may have come to wrong conclusions. A long while ago, I did a study and I don't know if the title was, but the subject matter was the following. What you see, we should be able to finish it. is all there is. So this is a bias of the mind. We are conditioned, we are created with this protective mechanism. But it has its downside. And this is connected to the idea of fast and slow brain. So we are programmed. If our leader does 3 presentations, and shows us these truths that are on this board, we believe we're programmed this way. All she said is all there is. And I'm hoping by the studies I've done in the past, where I have gone in and analyzed Elder Jeff's material, where I've done studies on the nature of humanity, where as an amateur scientist, I've begun to talk about psychology, and the construction of the human mind. The collection of all of that is for us to understand and realize, acknowledge and accept that when someone says, this is the 25-20, that's not all there is to that subject. If you hear 3 presentations on the 1850 chart, you know still very little about the 25-20. It's just not enough. So as an example, you'll remember that there was a fight in our movement with the church. So where is the 25-20 found? Or the scattering and gathering? Book Leviticus, chapter 26. So we're in Leviticus 26, and the church, its theologians, teach the following about the 25-20. That the theme of the chapter is about intensity. Things are getting worse. Now, because this movement had an agenda, a mission, and we have these charts, which are all about numbers. Our messenger said, they, the theologians, are wrong. The 25-20 is not about intensity in Leviticus 26. It's about what? Does anybody remember? It's not intensity, it's time. So this was the great push. We had the high ground, they had the low ground. We were correct, they were wrong. It took me several years not to work out the answer, but to be brave enough to teach the answer. But the church was correct. The church was correct. The theme in Leviticus 26 is about increasing intensity. It's not repeating the 7 times 4 times. So the reason I mention that is that if we're not careful, we fall into the trap because it's a human bias. It's a protective mechanism that we have. All we hear, all we see is all there is. And it's just not the case. You just need someone to show you some more information to prove that point. This is not a criticism of Elder Jeff. It's not a criticism of the members. It's a statement to show us that we need to understand our own humanity, our construction, recognize its weak points, and make sure we don't fall into this trap. Everything that's on this board that we have been taught in a very simple fashion cannot be all there is about the issue of the Sabbath prophetically. And what you think you might know about what has been taught as a group, when you're questioned, with some probing questions, you begin to see that you understand it differently and it's not as straightforward as you think.
Well, I understand the church is right about the 25-20, but was the movement also correct? We had about the 25-20. Can you clarify that?
So the question is about the example that I gave of the 25-20. And I try to simplify a very complicated point. So my point wasn't to identify fault or success with any party. Of course, this movement had many things correct about the 25-20. The point I wanted to raise is that when you receive information from a trusted source, we fall into this human part of our human condition that says if this trusted source says it's 1, 2, 3, and they don't go any further, that's all there is to the subject. And it turns out that that's not the case. So I could speak many things on the 2520 related to this issue. There's much more to it that we never understood. And the struggle in 2012, the prediction of the Sunday law, one of the reasons that was not accepted is because people believed they understood all there was to understand about the 2520. Because that's all they had been taught by their trusted source. And then when someone says there's another way to look at this problem, our biases prevent us from accepting additional information. Okay, so what we have taught yesterday is that there's a problem in our movement related to Sabbath keeping. And it may be because we're Laodicean, we've become worldly. That's a different conversation. What I wanted to explore was a prophetic reason. If one exists. And the reason why I wanted to tackle that is because I got another question, which I didn't read out. And that was related to something that I had seen a long time ago. Which is why I said it's taken so long. And that's to do with the book Early Writings, which is Spiritual Gifts, Volume 1, really. In 2019, Elder Tess did a study based upon the chapter, The Sins of Babylon, that said that 1850 was the Sunday law and the test or the issue was slavery. And without being too specific, someone laid out this history. And they gave some waymarks in application. And the point of all of that was the following. When you go to Millerite history here, the church is focused on the 1888 history, which is the Sunday law. And they don't really deal with the 1850 issue. Because in the studies that Elder tested here, taking not just the title of the chapter, Babylon, and its sins, which is a biblical term. These two words, Babylon and sin, are biblical terms. When you read the chapter, the subject seems to be about the slavery issue that's going on in the United States. And how God will punish that nation because of its sins. And those sins are not the sins of America, they're the sins of Babylon. Which dovetails into our understanding of what Babylon is composed of. We might view it in different ways, but one way is the threefold union. That the sin of Babylon, the sin of the nation in that history, is slavery, not Sunday keeping. So we have this model here, the 1850 model, which we call the Sunday law test or issue, being slavery, not Sunday. And we see that this is dealing with human rights. I put the Declaration of Human Rights because that's something we've spoken about. That's something we've spoken about in the movement. We've done teachings on that. We saw how the political landscape changed in the United States over this 40-year history. Why slavery here was no longer an issue. Because between 50 and 88, laws were passed that abolished slavery. So we dealt with that. And what that seems to indicate is the great test is either Sunday or slavery at the end of the world. Which model do we want to go for? And if it's this one, the 1850 model, then maybe that's why the Sabbath is diminishing in our relationship with the Sabbath is changing. Because if it's not the prophetic test, then maybe it's not the moral test. So therefore, we go into Sabbath education in the spirit of the law, not its letter. Then we developed another model. This is Thoughts from the Mount of Blessing, page 63. And in that passage, Ellen White speaks about twin institutions. She says, in Eden, two institutions were created by God for the needs of humanity. The seventh day, the Sabbath, and marriage. And she says, in this history of the great controversy, both of those institutions have been attacked, damaged, and in many ways destroyed. And she says it's the work of the Adventist church, of God's people, to restore those institutions, to restore the Sabbath and marriage to their rightful place. Now, this Eden to Eden model, firstly, is not something that Elder Tess invented or came up with. What she did was refine it to the understanding that we have today. Which is shown in this lower graphic. And what she added to our understanding, a vital piece of information, is what? What did she add that we have picked up? So what she picked up, Kathy has just rightly said, that it's not just this beginning to end story. She refined that into a very precise and neat chiasm. And Adventism hasn't done that. But Adventism understands this concept. So we thought this movement was raised up to strengthen and put marriage on its proper footing. And I don't know what work you think we have done to achieve that goal. But we're at the end of the world. And if we look at Adventism, they understand this model. And what are they now doing? What's the church now doing? Anyway, doing.
We're taking a decided stand against LB.
So the church, in response to this prophetic call, is doing its job. They are taking the marriage institution, defending it and restoring it back to its Eden beauty. That all sounds good. But when the words come out, we say that's an anti-LGBTQ message. So you can see that in trying to fulfill prophecy, you can get things really wrong. And I don't think when we have discussed the work that the church is doing and its mistakes, I don't think we've seen it as a prophetic issue. We've seen it as a moral issue. And we're wrong to do that, I would suggest. Because if you don't see the prophetic reason of why things are being done, by them, you won't see the prophetic reason of why we should be doing things. And then we will say, this is a Laodicean member who just doesn't care about Sabbath keeping and they want to go to school because it's easy. We have to look at the prophetic reasons of why things are happening, why we are doing things. And the only tools we have are these models. So the problem is, one of them, when you go to this study, I and others had seen this before. It wasn't new. All of you will have read early writings and read this chapter and seen this, even though you may not have, it may not have clicked for you. Okay, so when we take this slavery model here, we're here, and they're going to go to war over this issue. And now we're in this history, the Civil War, which is the time of trouble. And now you get into problems. Where is this model being created? What's the source of this? So it's on the board, it's not a trick question. It's right here, it's Ellen White, The Sins of Babylon. That's the source of this whole model that we've developed. So this is Spiritual Gifts Volume 1, chapter 36. I think. Let me check. $33. So it'll be really small. This is chapter 33 of Spiritual Gifts. And that's all fine. It's all beautiful. If we just skip over to here, the time of trouble, is it in this book as well? What would your guess be if you don't know the answer? Yeah, because this book, Spiritual Gifts, is a condensed form of the Great Controversy. It's one of the earlier versions of it, and it gives the history of the Great Controversy. Okay, so what's going to happen when you skip forward a couple of chapters? We'll jump over to chapter 36. And what history are we in? Without, you don't have to look, you don't have to guess. We're in the time of trouble. So years ago, I did studies on how to read. And I spoke about the introduction, the body, and the conclusion of a paper. The lead paragraph, the lead sentence of a paragraph, all of those things. So we're in the time of trouble. We're in the first paragraph, which is the lead paragraph for the chapter. Which in its own way is the anchor and sets the theme for this chapter. And you can do the same in chapter 33. But in chapter 36, talking about the time of trouble. So I'm just going to read a portion of this paragraph. I'll paraphrase. I saw leaders consulting with each other. Satan and Satan's angels were there. They were busy influencing these leaders. I saw something that was written, a document. Copies of that document were scattered all across the world. And that document gave instructions to the authorities that said, unless the saints, the Christians, would give up their peculiar faith, which is not abolition. These are not abolitionists. Give up their peculiar faith, give up the Sabbath, and observe the first day, they should be killed. This is the death decree in Jacob's time of trouble. So the point I want to make is what you see is not all that there is. And if you've read early writings, I say 20 times or 10 times. You can't read it once. You begin to see the flow of the story. And when you see the flow of the story before chapter 33 and after chapter 33, and this is chapter 33, you'll see that the theme of the story is much more religious and much less political than might appear by just reading this chapter. The theme of the Sabbath runs through, we'll talk about spiritual gifts, it runs through that book. So when we start talking about its prophetic application at the end of the world, and we start looking at this model, or we start looking at the Eden to Eden model, we have to be careful how we process this information. When I say this information, what am I referring to? Am I referring to Ellen White? Or are I referring to Elder Tess? So you need to decide that, because you can't separate them. Elder Tess did not invent anything. She didn't create it. She did what all of us do. What Elder Jeff did. It's the only thing we can do. You take inspiration and you try to understand what it means. And it is both a science and an art to do that well. And that's why people get raised or get called the messengers. Because when normal people like you and I do that, I get nothing. And they're able to develop really sophisticated models. They're able to take out the important points and connect them together. But the story isn't that straightforward. And all I wanted to do at this camp meeting, when I saw the question about the Sabbath, was to begin a discussion of why our relationship to the Sabbath has changed, because that's a fact, it's changed. It wasn't to discuss whether it's changed for the good or the bad. It's to point out that chapter 33 isn't in isolation. It has chapters before and afterwards. And if we had done a study the movement, on chapter 36, not 33, this model would never have been developed. Because it would have been Sabbath, 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 all the way through. But because we focused on chapter 33, the subject of slavery has been brought up, and civil rights. So our study this weekend has not been to challenge the human rights component of our message. It's to try to understand, what does Sabbath keeping mean prophetically at the end of the world? What's its relevance? What's its place in prophecy? And I think that's a question worth discussing. Let's pray. Dear Lord, we thank you for your goodness towards each of us. As we understand our own humanity, it's my hope and my belief that you will continue to teach us and open the truths to us. So not only may we understand our biases and our prejudices, but we will begin to become free of them. Because the truth sets one free. The Sunday law is fast approaching. The great test is upon us. As all this is happening and the world is in agitation, may we better understand our relationship with the Sabbath and its role in prophetic end time history. Amen. I want to thank everybody for joining us. And as we close this study and bring this camp meeting to an end, as we normally do, I want to invite everybody to put their cameras on and go on to the gallery view so everybody can say hi to one another. Thank you. Goodbye.
Gracias.
Et au
Adiós.
revoir.
Wow.
Und
Aí, ok.
Eu também. Você me viu? Ainda não vi você.
Mentirinha.
Também não te vi ainda. Agora te vi.
Ai, minha rosa lá.
Eu te vi agora. Ah,
Siapa yang lain?
Luan kejauh.
Meeting. Kemarin pun right? Katanya everything is fine. Yeah. Good. Yeah. Iya, iya benar. Ya.
Gabriela, this time you can unmute your mic and speak.
Go ahead meeting kita kan.
Too late now, but I don't want to speak.
Ini hati-hati ya.
It's nice to hear your voices.
You too.
Wow. Udah kan kecil.
Over.
Gimana udah kan kecil. Mungkin gaya ya. Kadang kayak gitu. Sekarang. Bukan yang gitu. Iya.
Mau Tahiti.
Sylvie!
Yeah, this is good.